Some of you have way too much experience with those sirens when you drive, but that's an entirely different story for another day, isn't it? Hey, I want to update you on a couple of things real quick before we get rolling. A couple of things related to our For Callaway initiative, some of the stuff that we do for our community. One is this. I want to give you a quick update on the land and the building development that's going on as we're building a place for Callaway. We're excited because behind the scenes we've been doing a lot of work. There's been nothing really to show for it yet, but we've been doing a lot of work behind the scenes getting everything in order. And July the 8th and 9th, our architect is going to be here, and we're going to be doing a lot to finalize the master plan and basically get him to the point where he can wrap up the initial schematics. And so then we'll have construction drawings in the next couple of months after that, and we're looking forward to being able to show you all of that. And the other thing we're going to be doing that week that he's here is we're going to be finalizing the budget or the scope, how much we're going to spend on phase one, because we won't build the entire master plan at once. So we're going to finalize how much is responsible and wise for us to build in phase one. So I tell you all that because for two reasons. One, I would love for you, primarily I would love for you to be praying for all of us who are a part of that decision-making process, our board, our stewardship team, staff, all of us as we're figuring that out and nailing that down. I'd love for you to be praying for us as we do that, and we'll let you know once we get some details on all that. We'll be sharing that with all of you. And if you haven't participated in, or maybe you weren't around at the beginning of the year when we were talking about being a part of a place for Callaway, we're doing a 2-year giving initiative to help fund this. And if you've got interest in being a part of that and participating, you can stop by the suite and ask them, or you can go to forcallaway.com, and find out all the info there. By the way, that's a great resource, that website, to share with people in the community if they ask you about our facility. Forcallaway.com's got a lot of information. And we just put, if you haven't seen it, we just put on that site some drone footage of the land. So if you haven't seen all the land, which unless for some reason you had time to kill and you stopped and walked it, then you haven't. So you can just go watch some drone footage of it if you want to see what all the land looks like. So we're there. The other thing for Callaway-wise I just wanted to remind you of is we're really excited on August 8th and 9th to be hosting the Global Leadership Summit right here. We're going to be a streaming site. And I hadn't told you guys this, but that our team, and this was not me, it was our team, but our team of people, we had a lot of volunteers who participated, who hosted the summit last year for the first time. We were one of the top sites, based on survey results, we were one of the top sites in the nation. We were in the top 10% of 500 and some different sites last year. They did a phenomenal job. It's an extraordinary, extraordinary event. We're going to be hosting that again this year. A lot of names that are terrific. Pat Lincioni, who is just a guru when it comes to team building and team culture and hiring and all of those things. He's going to be speaking at it. They just added Ben Sherwood, who just transitioned out of the role of being the president of all of Disney and ABC Media. He's going to be at it. Craig Rochelle will be there. Just a lot of great names. I think you got some information on it when you came in. There's some tables up there. If you want to stop and get info, you can. But the deadline, the early bird deadline for all of us who attend Journey is Tuesday to get $89 tickets. $89 tickets. That's about $120 off the regular ticket price. So if you want to grab you a ticket, I would highly recommend you do it. You can do that by Tuesday. You can just go to glsjourney.com. It's got a code right there for you. You can put Journey Church in as the organization. You'll get an $89 ticket, so you will be set and good to go. All right, so if you weren't with us last week, we started this series, Killing It. And I want to start today, I'll catch you up in just a minute if you weren't here last week, but I want to start today by asking you another question. And this question is a little difficult. As a matter of fact, you're going to bristle at this question when you hear it, and you're going to think, who does he think I am? I'm not that kind of person. But just hang with me for a second, okay? The question is this: when do you feel superior to others? When do you feel superior to others? And your answer is never, right? My answer is never. I'm not that kind of person. But I want you to think of it a little bit of a different way. What are the circumstances or what are the situations that you find yourself in where you start thinking to yourself, you know what, I think I'm doing all right? Or the people that you're around that you find yourself going, you know what, I'm doing pretty well. I'm doing pretty well. What are the situations that cause you, and again, you don't think of this as a bad thing, and I'm not necessarily saying it's a bad thing, but when do you find yourself in one of those circumstances or situations that you feel like you're doing pretty well, and maybe, and none of us would want to admit this, but maybe even maybe it creeps in every now and then that you start to feel a little bit superior. It may be when you're around certain types of people and you begin to feel superior or feel like you're ahead of the game in some area. When you're around this group of people, you think, you know what, I'm doing pretty well. I'm pretty successful. I mean, go back to, high school reunion, or you're hanging with a group of peers who all work in the same industry as you, or, you're with classmates or whatever, you're at a camp if you're into sports, and you realize, I think I'm doing pretty well, because you start comparing yourself to other people and go, hey, we're not so bad. Or it may be when you're at a certain gym, you find yourself at a certain gym, and you start looking around and going, I don't look so bad after all. Think I'm in pretty good shape. Now, bring that up because this is what I hear all the time, and I'm not going to name the gyms, but there are certain gyms you go to and you go, oh, no, I'm not going back there because those are the people who are real athletes. And then there are certain gyms in Murray you go to and you look around and you go, these are my people. I am the athlete in this gym. It's incredible. I'm going to work out right here for the next 5 years, So it may be that for you. You find yourself in certain arenas going, I think I'm doing all right. Or maybe you find yourself in certain situations where, and you wouldn't use this terminology, but you realize, I think I've got a little bit more power than everybody else. In this moment, in this group, in this room, because everybody's looking to you to make the decision, or everybody's looking to you, they all want to know your opinion. Or you're with a group of people and you realize, I think they admire me. I don't mean that in a crazy way. It's just kind of like they really do admire what I've accomplished or where I've gotten in life. I think they'd like to be where I am. And you find yourself feeling maybe superior, maybe not quite superior, but you at least feel like, I'm doing pretty well. It may not be whose, it may be what's for you that create that. It may be, you got this house and then you go over to so-and-so's house, and again, it's just human nature. You start comparing and you go, I think I'm doing all right. I like my house a little bit better than all my friends' houses. Or maybe the car you drive and, everybody else pulls up. You realize, I feel pretty successful driving this car. Maybe the boat, you're like, yeah, you see their boat and you think, they wish I had my boat. I know they wish they had my boat. It's one of those deals. Hey, all of us find ourselves in certain situations and circumstances where before we catch ourselves, we know we shouldn't feel this way. Before we realize it, and we usually don't say it, we filter it really well, we monitor our behavior. But it creeps up in our heart and we start to have these thoughts of, I think I'm doing pretty well. And maybe, just maybe, none of us will want to admit it. Maybe we feel a little bit superior. Well, last week I told you we're spending 3 weeks. This is week 2, talking about this thing inside you and inside me that has a tendency to kill the things that we care about the most, to wreck the things that we care about the most. This little thing inside of you and me that we just pass off as that's okay and everybody's that way and there's nothing really wrong and that's just part of being human. But this thing in us has the potential to wreck relationships, has the potential to wreck our future, it has the potential to wreck our families, and those relationships that we won't be so close has the potential to cost us having the kind of rich relationships we want to have when we get to the end of our lives. And it's this thing called pride. It's this thing called pride. And as I said last week, this is not the good kind of pride that we all have. I got, pride in your workplace and the quality of work that you do or the kind of work that your team accomplished. That's good pride. There's nothing wrong with that. It's not the kind of pride you have in your kids or you have in your parents or you have in your nieces and nephews, whoever that may be. That's a good kind of pride. Nothing wrong with that either. It's not the kind of pride that you have when, you've accomplished something you thought was so hard and, it was so challenging for you, but you got it done. You just can't wait to tell everybody, look what, I was able to do. I was able to figure that out or get that built or, get that done. That's a good kind of pride. I'm not talking about that. You know the kind of pride I'm talking about, and so do I. It's the kind of pride that rattles around our hearts, and it shows up in some ways that we try to mask and camouflage and disguise. But it's actually doing damage. And oftentimes it's doing damage that we don't want to admit is even there. And as I said last week, that pride becomes a prison. It's a prison. It locks you in, and it locks God and others out. That pride is a prison that locks me in and keeps me from achieving and experiencing the things I actually want most. Because the things I want most are rich relationships, meaning, fulfillment, significance in life. Nobody who's full of pride and full of themselves ever experiences those things. So I can achieve a lot of success and I can have a lot of fun, but I can't get to there. So pride is a prison that locks me in, and it locks others out. It isolates us from others, and it locks God out eventually. There's no room. When you're full of yourself, there is no room for God. So we talked last week about pride's a prison. Humility is the key. The beauty of pride is, if there's some good news, silver lining in all this, it's that pride is a self-imposed prison, and you hold the key and I hold the key to get ourselves out of the prison. All we have to do is choose to be humble, but oh my goodness, that is so hard to do. And if you were with us last week and you spent the last week where this has popped up at different points, you know just how hard that decision to choose humility really is. If you had a moment where you were, starting to let pride rise up, and then it popped in your head, oh, I should be humble. You know in that moment that it's painful sometimes to choose humility. And you may have even, like I have at different times, said, you know what, I'm just not going to choose it. Like you saw it, you knew it was there, and you embrace pride anyway, because that's how hard humility can be for all of us. Now today, here's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about the group of people who are specifically challenged more than any other group when it comes to dealing with pride. There are a group of people who struggle with this more than others, and there's good news and bad news. It's what I call 3P people. The good news is you are one of those people. I have no doubt you're one of those people. So am I. And I say that's good news because when you see what the 3Ps are, you're going to go, oh, yeah, I wouldn't mind having a little bit more of at least one of those, maybe all three. But the bad news is because we all are people who have these three things or, at least one or two of these three things in our lives, we struggle with pride in ways that other people don't, and we are susceptible to the dangers and temptations and traps of pride in a way that most people don't have to deal with. So I thought, you know what, let's just take a day and talk about this and own this and at least be aware of what may be coming our way that other people don't necessarily wrestle with, but it is a constant in your life and in mine. So when I talk about 3P people, here's what I'm talking about. They're people who have a measure of power, possessions, and prestige. In other words, they're people who have a little bit more power than others, a little bit more possessions than others, a little bit more prestige than others. Now, when I talk about power, here's what I mean. Most of us don't think, oh, I don't have power. Like we think of people in political office or, CEOs or somebody as people with power. So we think I don't have much power, but you have power. When I talk about power, what I mean is this. You're a decision maker in some environment or in some circle, in some group. You're a decision maker. You're an influencer. If there's any group or any setting in which when you're there, you are a decision maker and an influencer, then you have a measure of power that there are other people around you that don't have. So it can be as simple as if you're a mom or a dad, then in that circle and in that setting, you have a little bit of power that your kids don't have. If you're the oldest sibling, then you know this, and the rest of your siblings can't stand this about it, but it's just the way it typically works. In most families, if you're the oldest sibling, you just got a little bit more influence than others, and oftentimes because you're the first child and the temperament and personality that comes with that, people just look to you for decision making or for opinions sometimes. If you're in a workplace and you oversee employees in any way or in any level, you have a little bit more power, a little measure of power that other people in that circle don't have. And whenever you have a little bit more power than other people, you're a teacher in a classroom, you're a coach on a sports team, whatever it may be, or a captain of a sports team, whenever you have a little measure of extra power, then you are more susceptible to pride than other people. Same's true if you have a measure of a little bit more possessions than other people. Now, this one's really hard to see, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time convincing you of this, but the reality is we all think about the people who have more than us and go, well, they're the ones who have it. But you have a little bit more when it comes to possessions than a lot of people. You know this. You have a little bit more than other people in our community. Like I could go globally and say, hey, all of us have a little bit more because there are people globally who would look at our problems and say, are you kidding me? I'll take your problems. Let's just swap places. But none of us are really convinced by that argument. None of us want to own that. But you think just in our own community, there are some people in this community who don't have quite as much as you. They're not resourced quite as well as your resource, which means, again, it's not a bad thing, but it means because you have a little more resources, you can be more susceptible to pride. And then this idea of prestige. Prestige just means this, that in certain circles, in certain places, there are some people who look up to you and admire you, or admire what you've accomplished, or admire where you are in life and what you have. They hope and aspire to be where you are one day. They hope and aspire to accomplish what you've accomplished one day. And again, this is most of us. None of us think we have prestige. This isn't even a word we use very often. But this is most of us. None of us think, oh, people admire me. But this is most of us. If you're a teacher, every time a student teacher comes in and works with you in a semester, you have a little bit of prestige because they are hoping that one day they are where you are. If you're a manager or you're in some position in a company and there are other people who are like, oh my goodness, and you don't think of it this way, but there are other people who are going, That would be my dream job. I wish I could have the job they did. I wish I could do what they did. You've got a little bit of prestige. Again, you never think of it this way. But that little bit of prestige puts you in a position to fall victim to pride more than other people. So, the thing I would tell you about is this. If you wrestle with this in your head and go, no, that's not really me, I just want you to know denying this is not actually a sign of humility. Denying this is a sign of dishonesty and self-deception. And denying it actually makes you more susceptible to pride. Owning it, being self-aware about it, is a healthy way to keep pride from rattling around and eventually wrecking your heart. So what I want to do today for the next few minutes is to walk you through a story and talk about how you overcome, because you didn't ask for more power, possessions, or prestige, but you've got it. I've got it. So how do we overcome the challenges of pride that come with that? And there is this fascinating story in the Old Testament that gives us an incredible lesson on how to do that. Now, let me just give you a little backstory on this, and then we'll jump into the story. You may or may not be familiar with this. Probably you aren't. But in 605 B.C., King Nebuchadnezzar, who's the king of Babylon, at the time he was the most powerful ruler in the entire world. Imagine that. You want to talk power. He had it all. Most powerful man in the entire world at the time. King Nebuchadnezzar did what he had done so many times in so many countries. He took his Babylonian army and he marched to the southern kingdom of Israel, and he conquered that group of people, and he conquered the capital city. He took all the valuables out of the country and out of the city of Jerusalem. He took all the valuables out of the temple. And then he did something that he did in every single country he conquered. And this was brilliant strategy. Imagine this, back in 600 BC, Nebuchadnezzar had already figured this out. Whenever Nebuchadnezzar would conquer a community or a country, he would go in and he would gather up all the best and the brightest of the young people. And he would deport them back to Babylon. He wouldn't let them stay in their homeland. He would take them back to Babylon as captives. But then he wouldn't treat them as captives once they were there. He would give them a Babylonian name. He would immerse them in the Babylonian culture. He would train them in the Babylonian ways. And then he would give them a job in his Babylonian government, a good job. And the reason this was so brilliant is because Nebuchadnezzar was stripping from each of these countries he conquered, he was stripping the core group of people who would be most apt to be revolutionaries. The core group of people who would be most apt to rise up and say, let's fight for our freedom and regain it. It was the best and the brightest of the young people in the land, so he would just take them out of the country, satisfy them in Babylon with these great jobs, get them settled in to spend the rest of their lives there. And then he didn't have as much of a fear of an uprising taking place in all of these countries that he had conquered. Well, in 605 BC, when he marches into Israel and he conquers the Jewish people, he does the same thing. He gathers the best and the brightest. And there are 4 names out of that group that you may be familiar with. If you went to Vacation Bible School, you know these 4 people. It was Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Daniel is the Hebrew name for Daniel. King Nebuchadnezzar actually gave him the name Belteshazzar, which is a Babylonian name, but that doesn't matter. We know him as Daniel. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, those are their Babylonian names, and we just happen to know them by that way. So all 4 of them are trained in the Babylonian culture, and then Nebuchadnezzar gives them jobs. These 4 guys are so sharp, they do so well, as they are educated in the Babylonian educational system, that they end up in high-ranking positions in Nebuchadnezzar's government. And not long after they get in this position, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. And he can't figure out how to interpret the dream. He doesn't know what he means. So he calls all of his wise men, and at this point Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were in this group. He calls all of his wise men. And he says, listen, I've got a dream and I've got to know the answer to it, but I'm not telling you what the dream is because I'm afraid you're just going to make something up. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you guys a chance to figure out what the dream is that I had and then interpret that dream for me. And if you can guess correctly and tell me what my dream was, I won't kill you all. If you can't, you got 7 days and then I'm taking off all your heads. Can you imagine? Well, Daniel goes back. None of the wise men can do it, and they're up in arms about it. Daniel goes back, begins to pray, and God shows him what the dream is. And he goes to Nebuchadnezzar and says, Nebuchadnezzar, God's told me, here was the dream you had. Here's what it means. And Nebuchadnezzar is blown away, and he says, oh, my goodness. And so he actually says, and think about this. This is a pagan king. He actually says, from this point forward, all throughout my kingdom, we are all going to worship the God of Daniel. Clearly, he's the most powerful God. And for a little while, they do. But then Nebuchadnezzar does what we all have a tendency to do when we have a little bit of power, possessions, or prestige. Nebuchadnezzar forgets and goes back to focusing on himself. And in those days, as a king, Nebuchadnezzar was treated as a god. So a few years go by, not too long, and then Nebuchadnezzar is back self-centered, and so he decides, you know what, I got an idea. There was a plain of Dura. It was called the plain of Dura, just outside the city of Babylon. He says, I want to build a 90-foot tall statue out there in my image and in my honor, and then I'm going to get everybody around to come, and we're going to get the band to play, and when the band plays, everybody's going to bow down and worship that image, and it's a way that they're worshiping me because I'm Nebuchadnezzar. I'm the most powerful man in the world. I'm like a god. I just want to make sure everybody recognizes that. Well, everybody does. They show up, they all bow, except for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and scholars think Daniel was probably off on assignment, and he wasn't there. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are like, nope, we're not bowing down because we serve the one true God. Nebuchadnezzar, again, you remember this story from VBS, don't you? Nebuchadnezzar gets furious with them. He takes them, he throws them in a fiery furnace. Long story short, God rescues them out of the fiery furnace. They come out. They're not harmed in any way. Nebuchadnezzar can't believe it. And again, he says, oh my goodness, I got it wrong. Everybody from this point on is going to worship the one true God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And for a period of time, they do. And then Nebuchadnezzar gets wrapped up in himself again. And so, 25 years from the time that Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego first entered Babylon, 580 BC, Nebuchadnezzar has another dream. And this dream scares him to death. But here's what's so fascinating to me. He writes down in his own words his experience. And we have a copy of it today. It's found in the document that we call the book of Daniel. And I just want to read you from Nebuchadnezzar's own words, from his own journal, exactly what his experience was as he has this dream that terrifies him and learns what it means. Because in the middle of this, there is a lesson. I'm telling you, none of us are ever going to be Nebuchadnezzar. But if we could just get this, if we could just understand and remember this, this is the antidote to the challenge of pride for those of us who have a little bit more power or resourced with a few more possessions, or we enjoy a little bit more prestige. So, here's what Nebuchadnezzar writes. He says, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at home in my palace. I was contented and I was prosperous. In other words, I had it all. I had a dream, he says, that made me afraid. As I was lying in bed, the images and visions that passed through my mind terrified me. Terrified me. So here's what he does. You could probably guess. He does what he did the last time he had a dream, and he couldn't figure out what it meant. He calls Daniel, who's still working for him in the government. This is 25 years later. And he says, Daniel, here's the dream I had. Can you please tell me what this means? And the minute Daniel hears the dream, he turns white as a sheet. Daniel is more terrified than Nebuchadnezzar. And it's funny if you read, and you can read this on your own in Daniel 4, but it's funny because the roles flip. And Nebuchadnezzar actually begins consoling Daniel. And he says, no, Daniel, it's not that big of a deal. It's going to be okay. And Daniel says, no, it's not going to be okay. You don't know what the dream meant. Daniel says, if only that had been about your enemy. But it's not. It's about you. See, Nebuchadnezzar had this dream of a giant tree. And he said the tree reached all the way to the sky. It was huge. It was a beautiful tree, and underneath this tree, all the animals of the earth lived, and, it was all of this. And then Nebuchadnezzar says he hears an angel. He hears an angel who says, cut down the tree. Cut everything down with a stump. And then Nebuchadnezzar says he hears the angel say something else. Here's what Nebuchadnezzar says in terms of the end of his dream. Here's what he hears. The decision, this is the angel saying this, the decision is announced by messengers. The holy ones declare the verdict, so that the living may know that. I want to pause because there's a big phrase here that's highlighted, more than usual for me, but I don't want you to miss this. So that the living may know that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone he wishes and sets over them the lowliest of people. And as he's telling Daniel all of this, Daniel goes, oh, this is not good news. If this were about your enemies, we'd be rejoicing. This isn't about your enemies. It's about you, Nebuchadnezzar. And then Daniel looks back and he begins to explain to Nebuchadnezzar this dream. And here's what he says. This is the interpretation, your majesty. This is a decree the Most High has issued against my lord the king. You'll be driven away from people and will live with the wild animals. You'll eat grass like the ox and be drenched with the dew of heaven. That's symbolic, right? No, as you're going to see in a minute, it's literal. 7 times, we think that probably means 7 years, will pass by for you until you acknowledge that. And here's our phrase again. Maybe we should pay attention to this. That the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone that he wishes. And then Daniel goes on. He says, the command to leave the stump of the tree with its roots means that your kingdom will be restored to you when you acknowledge that heaven rules. It is the only time in all of Scripture you see this phrase, heaven rules. This is Daniel's way of saying, listen, God has decided he is going to get your attention. You had 2 times and you struck out both times. He showed himself to you with me in the first dream, you forgot about him. He showed himself to you in the fiery furnace with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you forgot about him. Nebuchadnezzar, this is strike 3. God is going to do whatever he has to do until you, the most powerful man on the earth, understand that your pride is a prison, that you are not as powerful as you think you are, until you learn how to handle and manage your power, possessions, and prestige in a healthy, honoring way, until you realize, Nebuchadnezzar, that heaven rules, not you. You're going to face some consequences. So the story continues. 12 months later, so a full year passes, okay? And Daniel gives him some advice for this year. Daniel says to him, your pride got you into this. Humility is the only thing that'll get you out. So if you read the story, Daniel says, why don't you start taking your power, possessions, and prestige and use them to help the oppressed, to help the poor, to help the people that you're neglecting? Nebuchadnezzar blows him off. For a full year, this goes on. 12 months later, as the king was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon, he said, listen to this, is this not the great Babylon I have built as a royal residence by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty, standing up on the roof of his palace, looking around, patting himself on the chest, going, how great am I? And you read this story, and again, knowing the context of what he's been warned about, this is a point where all of us internally go, no, don't say that. You know, why wouldn't you learn the lesson? But we're all a little bit more like him than we would like to admit. Story continues. Even as the words were on his lips, a voice came from heaven. This will get your attention. This is what's decreed for you, King Nebuchadnezzar. Your royal authority has been taken from you. In other words, Nebuchadnezzar, you are a king, you are not the king. You have authority, but there is one with authority over you who can decree to you. You think you're the most powerful man in the world, nobody can tell you anything. I'm telling you, there's somebody who can tell you something. You are not in control. You just think you're in control. And then this voice from heaven continues. You'll be driven away from people and will live with the wild animals. You'll eat grass like the ox. 7 times or 7 years will pass by for you until you acknowledge that. And here's our phrase again. It's like God just kept beating it over his head. Until Nebuchadnezzar, you acknowledge. Until Matt, you acknowledge. Until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone that he wishes. And immediately, what had been said about Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. He was driven away from people and ate grass like the ox. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair grew like the feathers of an eagle and his nails like the claws of a bird. Now, if you're reading this or hearing this and you're so skeptical, you're going, that can't happen. This is all made up. No. There's actually a medical diagnosed condition for this. It's called boanthropy. Boanthropy is a psychological disorder in which a human believes himself or herself to be a cow or an ox. You can research this for yourself. It's still in existence today. There are documented cases in recent history of people who are suffering from this. They think they're a cow or an ox, and they just, if you let them, they'll just live out in the field and act like one. And so this is something that they've diagnosed and they've begun to try to figure out how to treat people with. And this is exactly what happens to Nebuchadnezzar. Story continues. At the end of that time, at the end of these 7 years, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven. Just pause right there. This is Nebuchadnezzar's way. Now remember, he's writing this account for posterity. And he says, it took me 7 years. But at the end of 7 years, I humbled myself. At the end of 7 years, I raised my eyes toward heaven and acknowledged, I am not the Most High. I'm the most powerful man and have been on the planet. But I don't have ultimate power. I raised my eyes and humbled myself towards heaven, and my sanity was restored. In other words, my pride was my prison, and I finally figured out humility was the key. And then I praised the Most High. I bet he did. I honored and glorified him who lives forever. His dominion, think about this. This is the most powerful king on the planet, and he's saying this. He's writing this for his people throughout his kingdom to know. His dominion is an eternal dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the peoples of the earth are regarded as nothing. He does as he pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of earth. I'm not as powerful as he is. No one can hold back his hand or say to him, what have you done? Nebuchadnezzar says, I can't boss him around. I've been trying to. He's ultimately in control. At the same time that my sanity was restored, Nebuchadnezzar says, my honor and splendor were returned to me for the glory of my kingdom. My advisors and nobles sought me out. I was restored to my throne and became even greater than before. But he's not going to handle his power, possessions, and prestige the same way this time. He's learned his lesson. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, not me anymore. It's not about my glory and my kingdom. Because everything that he does is right. Imagine saying this after 7 years of dealing with this disorder, this psychological disorder. But this is what humility has done for Nebuchadnezzar. It has helped him to recognize, I may be a man of authority, but I am also a person under authority. And what he does is right. And all his ways are just. And those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. Nebuchadnezzar says, I finally figured out how to kill my pride, but I had to learn it the hard way. Now, if you're like me, you hear that and you read that and you think, okay, Matt, fascinating story. I mean, that's great. It's pretty crazy that we have a historical account of that from Nebuchadnezzar from 600 BC, Fascinating story. But what in the world does that have to do with me, or what does that have to do with you? Well, here's the lesson that's woven throughout this story that I think if Nebuchadnezzar were here today, we were able to interview him and, it's okay, you went down in history and all this, and you accomplished this and this. And, we'd want to know how he did all that. But I think in the middle of all that, he would say, no. I don't want you to miss this one thing. I don't want you to miss this one idea. Here's what I think he would tell us. That what you have is a stewardship. It is temporary, and you're accountable. I think Nebuchadnezzar would look at you and me and say, listen, with whatever extra measure of power, possessions, or prestige you have, do not forget what you have is a stewardship. In other words, that's a word we don't use a lot, but what you have, you are not the owner of, you are the manager. That power, that possession, that prestige that puts you a little bit ahead of somebody else is not your own. It is on loan from a good and a generous God. This is what Nebuchadnezzar would tell us. It's yours to manage. It is temporary. You will not have it forever. Just like God took my power, possessions, and prestige from me at some point, you're not going to hold them anymore, either because you die and they're passed on to somebody else, or because God looks down and says, that is creating so much pride, it's killing them. I'm going to take the thing away that's about to kill them. But either way, it's temporary. It's given to you. It can be taken from you at any point. And maybe most importantly, Nebuchadnezzar would say, you are accountable. Why am I accountable for what I do with this? Because it's not yours. It's his. Why am I accountable? Because Nebuchadnezzar would say, the Most High I was hard-headed. It took me forever to learn this. The Most High, not me. The Most High, not you. The Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth, including your kingdom and my kingdom. We think we run our little kingdoms. We don't really run our little kingdoms. The Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth, and he gives them to anyone that he wishes, which means he can take them away whenever he wishes. So, in a very practical sense, here's what I think this means for you and me. I've got to look at the little bit of extra power we have. Again, we don't like thinking about it in that way. But the little bit of extra influence you have in certain circles, the little bit of extra decision making, you know, the places where everybody just turns to you, you get to make the final decision. In every one of those instances and environments, people who choose humility are people who hold that power with open hands. And they say, I have been granted this power by God. I did not earn it. It's on loan to me. And it's on loan to me for a very specific reason, because I am to give, serve, and defer with this power. I'm not to leverage it to always get my way. I'm not to leverage it to always, advance myself. Whatever this little bit of power, influence, decision-making is that I have, how can I use this for the good of others? How can I give this to someone else who maybe doesn't have as much of it? How can I serve somebody around me with this? Okay, I've been resourced with a little bit extra. And again, none of us think that's us, but it is. There are people in our community that I could sit down across the table from you and you could tell them all your problems and, financial stresses and everything, and in a heartbeat they would trade places with you. Because you've got more than they have. I've got more than they have. They would love to be where we are. And your Heavenly Father says, I just want you to hold that with open hands. I want you to remember those possessions. They were given to you on loan from me. And you are to give and serve and defer with them. Sure, enjoy them. Nothing wrong with enjoying some of them. But you need to be asking yourself, how can I take the little extra that God has given me? And how do I need to use this to benefit someone else? How can I leverage it to let somebody else who has a little bit less than me enjoy it? How can I leverage it to help somebody else with a little bit less than me move forward because of it? And then your prestige, those environments, those circles, there may not be many of them, but those circles where somebody looks up to you, somebody admires you, somebody wishes they were where you were. How can you take that little bit of prestige you have and hold it with open hands and give it away? How can you take what that prestige affords you and use it for the benefit of somebody else? How can you open up doors? How can you create connections for somebody else that they can't get on their own because they don't have what you have and they are not where you are, but you can open the door. You can help them get where they need to get. You can help them advance and grow. You can help meet a need if you just take the time to do it. This is what I think Nebuchadnezzar would tell us. I spent my whole life the king of the most powerful empire in the world, and I didn't pay any attention to the people who had less than around me. I didn't pay any attention to the people who I was resourced a little better than until I learned this lesson. So my question to you is simply this. What do you need to do? What do I need to do with a little bit of extra that God has given to you? What do I need to do with a little bit of extra that God has given to me? If you don't want that little bit of extra to create pride in you, if you don't want to fall for the temptation of feeling like I'm pretty good and start comparing and I'm a little bit ahead of them and I'm a little bit ahead of them and feel a little superior to them, if you don't want to fall for that, if you don't want to fall into the trap of thinking everybody ought to listen to your every word because you're just a little farther along and you're smarter than they are, if you don't want to fall into the trap of losing the ability to be curious and listen and ask questions, if you don't want to fall into the trap of thinking people should just do what I say when it comes to this, and they just need to fall in line, if you don't want to fall for that, you got to take whatever God's given you and hold it with open hands, not with closed fists. Now, if you're wondering how you're doing at this, I'll tell you how you can test it. Pay attention to your response and reaction whenever a little bit of your power, a little bit of your possessions, a little bit of your prestige gets threatened. What happens when circumstances take place that cause you to go, oh no, I might lose a little bit of that? What happens when somebody comes along and you think, oh no, they may take a little bit of that? If you find yourself closing your fist, If you find yourself resisting and fighting back, you haven't learned this lesson yet. You have forgotten that it's on loan to you, and it is not yours in your power to control. That the Most High is sovereign over your kingdom and my kingdom, and He gives what He gives us to whoever He wishes. As long as you think you're in control, you will resist and fight whenever it's threatened. Once you realize it was given to you by God, you can continue to hold it with open hands, grateful for the time you have it, leveraging it for the benefit of others, giving it to help others advance, and content if it's ever taken away. Because what you have, what I have, is a stewardship. It is temporary. And we are accountable. One day we will answer and give an account to our Heavenly Father for what we did with what He placed in our hands. So the challenge this week is simple. Be honest about the little extra power, little extra possessions, little extra prestige you have. And then figure out how to choose humility and give it away, leverage it, serve with it, defer with it for the benefit of somebody else. Let me pray for us. Father, would you help us to know how to do this? Thank you for placing in our hands what you have. But we don't want to misuse it, and we don't want a good gift to end up becoming detrimental to the things that matter most to us because we let it create pride in us. So help us to choose humility this week with what you have put in our hands. Thank you, Jesus, for modeling this for us in such a powerful way. And it's in your name we pray. Amen.